Today we'll talk about three primary Bible versions that I use myself and give you some strengths and weaknesses of these versions and recommend them for your use. These are the three that I use regularly. Later on, I hope to address some others like the King James Version and paraphrases like the Message and the Passion versions. But we'll start with these three, the English Standard Version, the New International Version, and the New Living Translation. They're very widely used, they're very highly respected, and any one of them would be good for everyday reading. What I recommend is when you're doing study, use three. That way you're not relying on one translation or one particular outlook on a passage to give you the meaning. There are many outlooks, there are many variations that you're going to find among translations. This little trio here, the ESV, the NIV, and the NLT, will give you a good overview. And if you find that these three agree on something, or even if two of them agree on something, you are going to be safe. One thing that is good not to do, if you're doing a study, is to go with an interpretation that relies on only one translation, where you don't have any other versions that are close to it. If that happens, and it does happen, just be careful. It may not be an erroneous translation. It may be okay, but it may be misleading as well. All translations have weaknesses. All translators have their own biases and conscious or unconscious outlook that affects translation. This is why if you're going to be using translations, it's good to use more than one. Three is a really good number, and so we're going to go on with these. The things that we see with all three of these versions is that the scholarship is very good with all of them. It's evangelical scholars. There's groups of them. Each one of these versions is done by dozens of translators working over a long period of time and thrashing it out. Sometimes, yes, having arguments, sometimes having disagreements. But when you have a team of translators, as all three of these do, you're usually going to be pretty clear from biases and prejudice creeping into the translation, which is a risk that you take by using a single translator version. The ones that come to mind are the Message and the Passion, both done by individuals by and large, though they do have friends that they consult with. So with these three, you're going to be pretty safe. Starting with the ESV. The ESV is very literal. It's very word for word. They take the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and the Greek, and they try to follow more or less the structure of the sentence as it's seen in the original languages. Now, this has strengths and weaknesses, but if you're going to do word studies, if you're going to do very close analytical study, this is the one that I usually start with. I don't use it a lot for casual reading, for devotional reading, though I have from time to time. In my view, the ESV is most helpful as a study edition that gives you a very clear idea of how the original language looks when the translator starts out on it. It was adapted from the Revised Standard Version. They made arrangements to take the translation, the RSV, and to revise it and overhaul it in a much more evangelical direction than the RSV translators and their bosses, if you will, at the National Council of Churches were comfortable going. So it's a very strong translation. It's very helpful, and I use it for word studies and very close analytical work if I'm looking at a particular passage. I also keep a copy handy when I'm doing my regular prayer and devotional reading. I always have a copy of the ESV handy because it's good for saying, okay, what does a literal word for word rendering of this look like? That's the strength of the ESV. Another strength of the ESV is that they do publish it in a reference edition with center column references. These references are very helpful, they're very sound, and if you get used to using them, you can learn a lot by comparing references at different points in the scriptures. The next one that we'll take up is the New International Version, the NIV. Again, it was started in the 60s as a planning project, and the evangelical groups that were saying, the King James is just too out of date. We're not comfortable with the RSV. We feel it's a little too liberal. We need something that's fresh and new and that will give us a good, clear idea of the text for ministry work and devotional reading as well. It's a good halfway point between the ESV on one hand, which is very word for word, and the NLT on the other hand, which is more free, thought for thought, phrase for phrase. It straddles the divide between pretty literal and pretty free. It's a good middle ground, and it's very reliable. Again, it's been around for a long time. It's gone through substantial revisions. I've used the Psalms and Proverbs in the NIV myself for a very long time, and I do keep going back to it. I often have a copy close by when I'm reading. Like the ESV, the reference edition of the NIV is very good. They did a very fine job with the references that they have there, if you get one with the complete references. I'm not dealing with study editions in this series yet. I'm going to stay primarily focused on translations. So the NIV is a good middle ground. Then over on the freer side, you have the New Living Translation. Now, people my age and older often grew up in the 60s and 70s reading the Living Bible, which was a straight-ahead paraphrase, one of the most well-known and much published paraphrases ever. In the 60s and 70s, people, especially young people, were reading the Living Bible. It sold huge numbers of copies. Over time, their publisher decided to say, let's do a revision of it in a more scholarly direction so that we can keep that free-flowing, easy-to-understand sense that the Living Bible had, but we'll have some really good scholars join us so that this becomes more accurate. If you read articles by scholars on the Living Bible, they just panned it almost 100% because it was a paraphrase. It wasn't trying to be a scholarly, accurate translation. It was an accommodation to people who couldn't read the King James Version, and that there weren't very many other versions that were easy to understand in those days. The NLT, like the other two that I mentioned, has a very fine team of translators. They're all very competent scholars, and it will often bring out little nuances that you don't get with the other two. It majors on a free-flowing, easy to read, easy to understand. It doesn't quite get over into the paraphrase category, but it gets closer than the NIV will. And I like the NLT. It's highly respected by many scholars, and it sells a lot of copies. People like the NLT because it's easy to understand. So when you're looking at all three of these, the ESV, the NIV, and the NLT, you've got the ESV, which is more word for word. You've got the NLT, which is more thought for thought. It communicates the ideas on a larger scale rather than trying to go phrase for phrase through Hebrew or Greek. And the NIV is in the middle. Any one of them would be a safe translation to use unless you're an adherent of the King James Version and don't feel as though anything other than the King James is a good idea. We will take that up in a later video, but either one of these three versions will be a good choice depending on your taste and what you're using it for. I use the NLT mostly for dip into it, devotional reading, checking translations, looking for another perspective. It's very helpful for that. And like I said, if you get used to using the three of these together, or two of them, but three is better, you will get a pretty well-rounded idea of how even very tricky passages can be handled. Again, the footnotes in the translations are all very important. If you get used to looking for the footnotes, you'll be blessed. Now, if you're doing straight up devotional reading your Psalms with a cup of coffee or something, or reading the Gospels just to, think about Jesus, well, you may not want to go into the footnotes for these translations. But if you're doing study, don't do studies unless you're using the footnotes as well as the main text. And again, if you have center column references, make sure to use those when you're studying. Again, any one of these three will be okay and safe. You will not go astray if you're reading one of these. But if you're trying to really figure out a passage, go and use all three if you have the time and the opportunity. Most people have these versions on their phones with different apps. I use these apps myself, but these are the three that I use most often. I will get into other ones, as I said earlier, in the future. And we hope that this series on biblical insights is helpful, and we encourage you to read along with us, listen along with us, and hope to see you again soon. God bless you.